Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today I'm joined by Avery Rosa. Avery is a personal trainer, NSCA strength and conditioning specialist. He has a BS in exercise science, and he is just kind of wrapping up his master's now. And he recently authored a very cool study in which I know a lot of you listening will be interested in. It kind of compares multi-joint versus single joint exercises, and that's kind of what we're going to dive in today. So thanks for coming on, Avery.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, you bet. So kind of the first place that I wanted to start is you recently performed a study called the hypertrophic effects of single versus multi-joint exercise of the limb muscles. And it was a systematic review and meta-analysis. So could you maybe give some background on why you kind of wanted to do this study?
Yeah, sure. So I guess it started off pretty simply. It was a paper assigned to me in class by Dr. Schoenfeld, and it was really just on a topic of our choosing. I think we had some pretty good flexibility with what we could have chosen for the topics, and I guess this one just interested me in particular. I feel like it's something that, if it's not debated frequently, it's at least something that people think about, not only for our own training, but also if we're personal trainers and prescribing programs to people. We might actually wonder if there's significant differences between single joint and multi-joint exercises, and at least the individual benefits that each one carries. So I feel like it's something that could be looked at a little binary, and I just kind of wanted to open that up a little more and take a more nuanced look into things.
Absolutely. And I totally agree. I think that maybe a handful of years ago, it was kind of like, if you're a bodybuilder, you had to do a bunch of single joint movements and isolation lifts. And then I feel like it kind of swung the other way, in which it was like, okay, you actually don't need to do any of that. If you're doing your pressing and your back movements, your arms are going to grow, so you don't need to do isolation movements. So I think this will be a really cool study to dive into.
Absolutely. And I hope it kind of makes some peace between both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from there, a good place for us to go to is kind of the methods of the study. So kind of what you guys did, and then we'll kind of dig into the results and some takeaways from there.
Yeah, of course. So naturally, we were looking at single joint and multi-joint exercises, but for our criteria, we were comparing single joint versus multi-joint, as well as the addition of single joint to multi-joint versus multi-joint alone. So we're kind of looking at both of those, and they were sub-analyzed as well to see if there was a difference between those. We're mostly looking for validated measures of hypertrophy, so, DEXA scans, MRIs, ultrasounds, circumference measurements, that type of thing. We wanted to make sure all of that was even across the board. Looking for a minimum of once per week for at least a 6-week protocol for the actual training taking place. And stuff we kind of excluded from the analysis was pretty much any and all work done by Barbalo and colleagues, just because there was a little controversy, and there was a paper named Improbable Data Patterns in the work of Barbalo et al., led by Andrew Vygotsky, that kind of went into just how nonsensical a lot of the studies were in terms of the numbers they were coming up with. So none of that was included. Otherwise, we actually would have had a larger, sample for the actual review and analysis. Because as you know, there's only 7 studies that were included in this. So it's a pretty small analysis that took place. But we mostly focused on the limb muscles as well, just because the trunk muscles are unlikely to be affected by single joint exercises. So whereas a tricep extension works the triceps, the pecs are less involved than if you looked at a bench press. So we just wanted to account for that too. And when it came to the statistical analysis, of course, everything we'll be talking about and looking at was expressed in terms of effect sizes with 95% confidence intervals.
Gotcha. And when it came to that criteria of multi-joint versus single joint, was there any other kind of criteria for what classified something as multi-joint? As, there's some exercises that are kind of like almost in between there. Was there anything else that you looked at there?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the studies that came up in our initial search and kind of screening, I don't think we found too many exercises that were up for debate as to whether or not they were single joint or multi-joint. I think most of it was pretty easy to decide on, but that would have made it interesting if we had to account for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to, so you mentioned that they were training at least once per week for 6 weeks. Was there any other criteria when it came to the training program in regards to like their level of training intensity? So like training to failure, or in terms of how many like hard sets per muscle they were doing per week, or their training volume?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, when we looked at things, all of these studies employed moderately loaded resistance training protocols with your repetitions ranging from 8 to 15. And all of them were trains to momentary muscular failure. So that was even across the board. All these studies trains to failure. The volume, however, was not equated, and because of that, we did sub-analyze to see whether or not volume had a significant effect on the results. So that's all stuff to take into account.
Awesome. Well, I think that kind of lays a good groundwork of kind of what you guys did, what you classified as multi and single joint, and what the kind of training programs looked like. So I think from here, we're good to kind of start diving into the results and getting into any takeaways here. So what did this kind of meta-analysis find here?
Yeah, so of course, when we're looking at single joint and multi-joint exercises, which I should alternatively synonymize with isolation and compound exercises as we otherwise might know them, the actual difference between their effect on muscle hypertrophy was almost negligible. The effect size was 0.07, which is pretty much like non-existent. Anything above 0.2 might be of more interest as a small effect. But we didn't notice a very big difference. And even when we looked at volume equated versus unequated conditions, we still didn't notice a very big effect, albeit a bigger one. We're still looking at 0.14, which at least statistically no one's really batting an eye at. When we account too for the single joint versus multi-joint, as opposed to single and multi-joint versus multi-joint alone, there was probably the smallest difference at all these, negative 0.01. So really in all of these conditions, this was kind of an analysis where we just came out like, well, there's no difference. But something to take into account too is we're working with a very small sample size, and perhaps with a bigger one, we might have actually noticed maybe a small effect leaning in either direction. It's a little trickier with these smaller sample sizes.
Gotcha. So effectively across most conditions, didn't really find a significant effect from doing single versus multi-joint movements. And with that, what was like the training status of these individuals? Were they kind of like recreationally trained in most of these, or did you have information on kind of their training status overall?
So this was actually interesting because only one study included trained individuals, resistance-trained individuals, whereas all the others had untrained people. So, you know, whether or not this is a good or bad thing kind of depends on how you look at it. But that's something to take into account is not only was this a small sample size, but it was largely untrained individuals too, which we'd expect to see a different response from trained individuals.
Right. And just in my intuitive sense of it would be that if in these kind of less trained individuals, we might not see as much of a difference between programs that contain both multi-joint and single joint, because at that point when you're relatively untrained, I think there's even research that like just running on a treadmill can produce hypertrophy. So it's their tolerance or their minimum effective dose for like everything to grow a little bit is probably pretty low. So my theory would be that maybe in more trained individuals, more of that kind of directed isolation work might become a little bit more important. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, so no doubt as people become more trained, and this is kind of why we want people to look at this with an open mind too, because it's not just what you see in the abstract. This is absolutely up for interpretation and kind of some dialogue here, because trained individuals, we'd expect them to benefit from additional single joint exercises, as you mentioned, especially if you're training for muscle hypertrophy and you're trying to focus very specific areas over time. As you notice, you may have certain deficits or certain lagging body parts. An important part of this too, and we did actually discuss it briefly in the discussion about one of the studies which looked into muscular subdivisions, where it was comparing overhead tricep extensions and bench press, and we saw differential hypertrophic effects between the two on various heads of the tricep, which kind of points out there may be biomechanical differences in single joint exercises where they kind of achieve effect that you can't get from a lot of multi-joint exercises. That's one of the benefits, and all the studies except for one looked at whole muscle hypertrophy. So we have to take into account, especially like I mentioned, with really trained people who are focusing very specific areas, they might care about those muscular subdivisions, whether or not their long or short heads of any given muscle are being stimulated to the degree that they want them to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely an interesting finding that I wanted to make sure that we covered in this, as well as even with maybe a lack of overall difference between multi-joint and single joint, you still kind of in that sub-analysis found that using some different isolation movements can kind of bring up or hypertrophy some different kind of subdivisions of the muscle. And are you aware, I'm guessing that would have also been in relatively untrained individuals that it found that result there?
I would have to double check, but I almost want to say that study was in trained individuals. I'd have to go back and see, but I know Dr. Schoenfeld was involved in that study, and he definitely wanted to bring it up as a topic for discussion.
Gotcha. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to me, it would be even stronger evidence for using those isolation lifts if they were untrained, as I would kind of expect, as we talked about earlier. If they're just doing multi-joint, I would kind of expect everything to grow. But if they were even seeing isolation movements being kind of beneficial there, then I would point that as, maybe an indicator that even untrained individuals might benefit from kind of working this stuff in.
Absolutely. I think even for untrained individuals, unless you're looking at things very minimalistically or really trying to make the most out of very short workout lengths, I think you have no reason not to be performing single joint exercises in addition to multi-joint exercises. Of course, you could look at this and be like, I'm only going to perform multi-joint exercises, and sure, you'll still grow, you'll still develop a reasonably decent physique. Whether or not you'll be, exploring your full potential, that's different.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think that the kind of cost to benefit analysis of that is in which single joint exercises probably don't produce, at least most of them, a ton of fatigue, and they're not necessarily like systemically draining to do, like a big squat or deadlift or something that's very taxing. And they can also hypertrophy that specific area as well. So I think there's a pretty good kind of stimulus to fatigue ratio there that even kind of untrained individuals can take advantage of.
And that's actually a very valuable point I was thinking of bringing up is the systemic fatigue factor and just how fatiguing certain multi-joint exercises can be. That's actually a topic that I chose to focus on more so for my thesis. So when that's published, actually, we'll be able to take an even better look at that for the lower body specifically, because lower body literature is kind of lacking in this area. But it's a huge thing to consider when it comes to the volume you're able to perform, the rest lengths you need to take, just the overall practicality of your workout sessions. There's a lot of benefits to including single joint exercises.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I know that a lot of my experience with working with clients and stuff shows me that they only have a certain capacity to perform so many multi-joint exercises in a single workout. Like if we're doing a leg workout, they might be able to do squats and lunges, but after that, we kind of have to move to more isolation work, and we can still get effective volume in there. But if I just try to keep stacking more multi-joint after multi-joint there, I think that it would quickly become just junk volume because they're so systemically fatigued and they can't really get in an effective stimulus.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important point when we look at the practicality of these things. When people are training themselves or when we're training other people, you'll kind of catch on to these things intuitively that if you're prescribing, more than just a couple multi-joint exercises in a session, especially with reasonable volume and intensity, someone can't keep up with like 5 to 10 different multi-joint exercises in a workout. You're going to need to include some single joint, simply for the sake, like you mentioned, that kind of junk volume, that volume where they're not really able to stimulate the muscle to the degree where, if they weren't systemically fatigued.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. Well, are there any other results from this study that you found particularly interesting or that might have relevance for someone looking to maximize their physique development?
I guess what I found interesting is kind of the different perspectives you can take when you're looking at the study. I know minimalists might be celebrating when they're first reading this, but I do encourage people to take kind of a deeper look and really think about these things. And kind of like we're discussing here, you can get away with, like, hypothetically an all multi-joint of resistance training program and do fine, but you have to take into account just what kind of volume and intensity you're able to get away with, what kind of exercise diversity you'll have. So I think just the study as a whole was pretty interesting, but it did make me want to see more studies on this topic so we can get a fuller idea, see more trained individuals, see more lower body studies, kind of just see a greater diversity of topics related to single joint and muscle joint exercises and their effect on muscle hypertrophy.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest kind of pieces there that I would like to see is definitely seeing this basic study, but with untrained and then with trained individuals, and see if with trained individuals, does single joint actually start to provide more and more benefits? My hunch would be yes, but of course, hunches don't always pan out to what the evidence suggests. So yeah, definitely would be a cool area. And I think that you also make a good point on, like, if someone was like just starting out to training and they're relatively untrained, and say they just want to be efficient in the gym, maybe they don't necessarily like love spending time in the gym, like maybe some of the people listening to this, then for them, they might be able to kind of get away with or progress really well with just a basic, like 2 or 3 day a week, full body workouts to where they just do kind of some basic multi-joint exercises, and they don't really worry about doing a bunch of like isolation work and spending more time on that. And if they're relatively untrained, it seems like they can still get very good results with doing so.
Oh yeah, and there's definitely some practical benefits to doing so. For example, if someone is very constrained on time and perhaps motivation too, if ultimately something I tell people a lot is, like, if you can stick to it, the program that you can stick to is going to be the one that's the most effective. So if you're able to get in there, be motivated, stay consistent with it, and progress yourself, if you can only do that with multi-joint exercises and you just can't bear to sit there doing, curls and extensions, then fine. Do what works for you at the end of the day, because that's what's going to yield you the best results. You just got to take the science into consideration.
Yep, absolutely. I think that, we could develop the very best program for a certain client, and it could just be theoretically the most optimal thing on paper. But if they're not able to consistently stick to it because they just don't enjoy it, or they don't like, I can't believe it, but some people actually don't like standing in the mirror doing curls. It's basically my favorite thing to do ever, but some people aren't into that. So, if they're one of those people and they can't stick to that program, it's not going to work for them. Very similar to how, most diets work for fat loss if you just sustain a calorie deficit over time. But if you can't stick to that diet, you're not really going to get anywhere. And it's a very similar thing here.
Yeah, and that's something where as trainers we realize too, sometimes we have to make decisions that on paper might look suboptimal, but it's simply because the client or the person we're working with is unable to do what's on paper optimal. Instead, you're kind of making some compromises. So certainly that's a big thing too, is you're always kind of balancing out efficiency and the client's own feelings with the workout versus what you feel like would work the best.
Yep, I absolutely agree. So if we were going to kind of round this study into a few practical takeaways, of course we've we've kind of hit on it as we've gone here, but if you could round it up into like a few practical takeaways, what would you kind of give the audience as some things that they can potentially take away or from this study, or things that this study kind of suggests?
Yeah, so I would say, firstly, we know that multi-joint exercises are more time efficient, and they should be a staple in training. You can generally you can lift more weight with them. You can progress them and develop a lot of muscles at the same time. They're certainly great to have, but single joint exercise inclusion is still ideal, if not necessary, to include for maximal muscular development. So you have to take your own goals into consideration when it comes to that. And it's important to remember, too, that multi-joint exercises can't cover every possible range of motion. And like we mentioned with the subdivision muscular hypertrophy, there are specific benefits to single joint exercises that simply can't be had by multi-joint exercises. Albeit small, they are still there. So
awesome. I really like that. And with that, we kind of touched on a little bit some of the future research that you would like to see and some of the research that you were doing, but is there any other kind of interesting research that you'd like to see in the future, or that you yourself would like to kind of do in the future?
Yeah, I mean, there's interesting studies coming out all the time, some of which I had the pleasure of being involved with. But I would certainly, specific to this topic, I would like to see more lower body studies. I think it's something hopefully more people are catching on to. More people are working out their legs and developing their leg muscles, which is great. So I think we should give that attention in the literature as well. Additionally, when it comes to single joint and multi-joint comparisons, like we mentioned with trained versus untrained, I'd also be curious about different intensities, because like we mentioned with highly systemic fatiguing exercises like the multi-joint, squats, bench press, things like that, there might even be a difference at different intensities if we're looking at training all the way to failure versus leaving some reps in reserve. That might be something to look at too. Additionally, I guess when it comes to my next study, which is being published as a conclusion to my master's, my thesis study, that's going to be an interesting one, where I do think I am filling a pretty interesting gap in the literature when it comes to single joint versus multi-joint exercise performance with different rest interval lengths. And that when we kind of look at more acute variables that might affect longitudinal training, because it was an acute study kind of looking at individual sessions with, say, like 1, 2, 3 minutes of rest in between sets, and kind of seeing how performance differed between these, how blood lactate differed between the exercises and in between sets. So I think that's going to be a really interesting one to stay tuned for.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll definitely have to have you on again once that's published, and we'll be able to cover that one.
Absolutely. Take a look.
Awesome. Well, if people really kind of enjoyed what we talked about here and they want to stay up to date on the research you're doing or anything else that you're doing, where would be a good place for people to kind of find you?
So you can find me on Instagram mostly. I don't post there very often, but when I do, it's probably going to be related to a research study or something I found particularly interesting. And of course, I guess the studies that are coming out. There's a couple I've been involved with already, so I'm sure you could probably just search my name and find them. All of them, I think, were very interesting studies that filled a gap in the literature. But of course, there's all my colleagues as well. Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, of course, being my mentor. He's a great guy. There's Greg Vasquez, who I worked with very closely. Dr. James Steele was involved in this coming one. I mean, just a lot of very smart people who I think all have very valuable content too. But otherwise, you could always reach out to me through email as well, just kind of more personally if you want to ask me a question or receive a copy of one of the publications I've been involved with. I'm always more than happy to share those.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Avery. I think it was very valuable for the audience to kind of get a rundown of the study, get some more context for it. If they just, read the abstract or just read the title and tried to run away with the takeaways and stuff. So thanks for coming on.
And thank you too, Ryan.